I'm Krissy Kasserman. I'm the Youghiogheny Riverkeeper. I work in a watershed just outside of Pittsburgh. It's a far more rural area than you see here. And I'm also going to talk about risks to water, but from a more rural and local perspective, I think. But I'll quickly tell you a story. A couple years ago, I had no idea that there were bomb trains in my watershed. And I was, my river is a whitewater river, and I was walking to the put-in with my whitewater kayak on my shoulder, and I got stopped by a train crossing the tracks, and it was a bomb train. And I looked at it, and I saw the tank cars, and I saw the placard, and I thought, I have no idea. I had no idea that was happening in my watershed. And I'm a waterkeeper, right? I pride myself on knowing what's going on in my watershed. So the fact that so many people have no idea that this is a potential impact in their communities, including those of us who pride ourselves on knowing what's going on in our communities and on our rivers, is a problem. What you're seeing here is a picture of the June 2014 derailment over the mouth of the Youghiogheny River. This is just upstream from where we are right now. And this is not a bomb train, thankfully. This was a mixed freight train. We had several cars that derailed. One of them was hauling light petroleum. You can see those couple cars were jackknifed off of the bridge, visible from underneath the bridge from the water, for several days. And when we saw this, the quote that I gave most often to the media following this was that we dodged a bullet. We were very fortunate. First of all, that this wasn't, a more explosive situation with more volatile cargo on that train. But secondly, that all of those cars, at the very least, stayed on the bridge and didn't end up in the river. But I think that was kind of a what-if moment for our organization. And by then, we were already concerned about the threat of oil trains. And when we saw this happen in such close proximity to a community, you can see the marina in the background, and over the mouth of our river, we became even more concerned. I'm going to just read some stats to you very quickly. The Center for Biological Diversity a couple years ago did an analysis that showed that 3,600 miles of stream are within a quarter mile of current and proposed oil train routes nationwide. Plus, over 73,000 square miles of lakes, reservoirs, and wetlands. That is a lot of water. They also, in the same analysis, found that oil trains pass within a quarter mile of protected critical habitat for nearly 60 federally listed threatened or endangered species, and countless more species that are either rare, threatened, or endangered at the state level. And that would include this little guy who lives in my watershed, only on a very few, the only place, it's a green salamander, the only place a green salamander lives in Pennsylvania is on certain rocky outcroppings in the Yough River Gorge directly across the river from an oil train route. So we are increasingly concerned about potential impacts to forest land and to terrestrial and aquatic species. I would point out that there, as you know and as you've heard, there's an enormous risk for water and air pollution, forest fires, and recovering oil from these areas as a result of an explosion or a derailment is not easy, and it's not fast. And a lot of water escapes into the environment, into our rivers, into our forests, before it can be contained. And as Angie mentioned, there was a great deal of time that passed between the Mount Carbon explosion and when boom was deployed in the river because of the explosive nature of that situation. And so I think we all need to be aware that even if we're in an area where emergency responders are close by, even if there's a good plan in place, it could still be hours or days before those plans can be put into place because of the danger of the situation. So in the Center for Biological Diversity report, and I'll just echo it here, they made a recommendation that oil train speeds not only be lowered in population centers, but also within a quarter mile of streams, critical habitats, important public lands. And I would add to that list drinking water intakes, because this is not just an urban issue. Very small amount of my watershed is urban, but we still have resources, communities, drinking water intakes that need to be protected. What you're seeing here is a photo of a coal train in my watershed, which is kind of an indication of days gone by at this point. But my watershed is a tourist destination. It's up in the mountains outside of the city here. We have a ton of natural amenities. We have tens of thousands of acres of public land. We have some of the highest quality streams in the area. We have incredibly high biodiversity. And we also have several drinking water intakes. It's a beautiful place to live and play. And these things are all put at risk by the presence of oil trains. We have concerns about economic impacts and threats to water-based recreation. Now, that's certainly not as significant a short-term concern as potential harm to life and property and drinking water. But for small rural communities that are generating the bulk of their income from tourism, it's definitely a concern. And the James River in Virginia was closed from Lynchburg to Richmond following the derailment and explosion there. So we've talked with local outfitters in Ohiopyle, which is kind of the epicenter of outdoor recreation in our watershed. And they've told us that even a week-long closure of the river would cost tens of thousands of dollars. That's a huge economic impact in such a small town. And so we have a lot of concerns about, I want to say if, but kind of the sense is, when, unfortunately, we have an incident with an oil train in our watershed, the impact that it's going to have on these small communities throughout our watershed in Pennsylvania. And I would also add that in addition to the immediate threat posed by oil trains, and by immediate threat I mean derailment, explosion, and water contamination, there's also been a lot of peer-reviewed research conducted on the public's perception of environmental risk. And so there is a concern that, the public perceives the area as contaminated, even if it's no longer contaminated, even if it's been 6 months or a year since an incident, that if there's the public perception out there that, the water's dirty, there's a risk to people, property, life, that it could have an even longer term impact to a tourism-driven economy. You've already seen this. Matt Crow showed it this morning. This is a report that we were involved in along with several other waterkeepers. It was released on Tuesday of this week by Waterkeeper Alliance, Riverkeeper, and Forest Ethics, and we were super excited to be involved. We were also very scared by what we saw. We, along with several other waterkeepers, performed visual inspections of bridges throughout our watershed, and what we found, frankly, was appalling. We found, on one particular bridge that happens to be located near the community where my daughter goes to school, crumbling concrete, bent steel. We found missing bolts in many instances. We witnessed bomb trains crossing this bridge and saw chunks of it come off and fall in the water. And so, I'm not an engineer, I'll be the first to tell you that, and most of my colleagues in Waterkeeper Alliance who conducted these assessments are not engineers, but when you're standing under a bridge watching a bomb train roll across it and you're seeing pieces of it fall off into your river, I would say that's pretty concerning. So Sean Dixon from Riverkeeper is going to speak more about this afternoon, but I would just say that poorly maintained bridges, we know that poorly maintained bridges increase the likelihood of an accident or a derailment. And what we found in conducting our inspections was that failing, undermining, and missing structural materials were most commonly found where bridge foundations sit in waterways. So we have the highest risk, we think, above our waterways. This is a picture of one of the bridges in my community that we inspected. And you can see crumbling concrete, exposed and rusted rebar, cracks in the foundation. This is the bridge where the derailment occurred in June of 2014, just outside the city here. You can see that main support in the center is bent, and it's unclear whether that's because of the derailment or because of another issue. But to see that from the water is pretty concerning. And then finally, this is a picture of boom being deployed on the James River following the derailment and explosion there. I would point out that emergency response, we have a lot of folks here talking about emergency response. It is often slowed by the location of responders, by fire, and by the risk for further explosions. So you can have the best plan in place, but there's potential for that plan to be affected by where you are, where the emergency response resources are, and the volatility of the situation. And it can, as I mentioned, take sometimes hours or longer to deploy boom. And finally, I would say, in this, where this bridge is, emergency responders in this community were unaware of the risk posed by bomb trains. They were unaware of the infrastructure issues along the bomb train route, and that's been the case in many of the small communities throughout my watershed. So I think that in a lot of instances, in major population centers, you have folks who are aware of this risk and who are responding to it. But in more rural areas throughout Pennsylvania anyway, and likely throughout the country, That's maybe not the case. So I would encourage you to talk to these folks, bring these issues to their attention. The folks in this community were so grateful that I pointed out this potential threat to them because they hadn't even considered it. And they're having trouble getting information, they don't know where to turn, and so we're working with them on formulating a response plan and on starting a dialogue with county and state emergency management officials. But those conversations largely weren't happening before we brought this issue to their attention. That's all I have. Thank you.